The words we live by. The National Broadcasting Company and its affiliated independent stations present The Words We Live By, the summer series of the Eternal Light program, which comes to you under the auspices of the Jewish Theological Seminary of America. Today we present the supporting cast of the Bible, the 13th in this series of 15 outstanding literary dialogues of past years, featuring Mark Van Doren and Maurice Samuel, two of America's foremost men of letters. Mr. Samuel.
Mark, I'm afraid that this morning we really have to digress a little from the program we originally set ourselves and take in a subject that's been haunting us, as it were, in between our talks, and that is the subject of conversations that appear in the Bible, or colloquies between men and God, interchanges of views, and that curious experience of men when they're confronted with the supreme power and they seem to talk back at it, and what this means.
Well, I have always found, Maurice, that is one of the most impressive and indeed magnificent things in the Bible, namely the freedom with which Abraham, for instance, Moses, Gideon, almost any one of the greater or major heroes of the Bible, the freedom with which he can converse with God and argue with him, or at any rate offer criticism, or offer at any rate queries as to why God is doing what he is, and whether he should do it. This, we may not often realize, perhaps distinguishes the Hebrew Bible from all other Bibles of the world, because I know of none other in which the human beings are so free. They are also bound, they are also under some kind of destiny. They must do this or that, or they will perish. And yet this sense of destiny that they have, this sense of necessity that presses on them, still leaves them free. So they act like people arguing with one another.
There's something more. There seems to be no kind of person that God won't talk to. He talks with Cain and gets a very wicked answer. He talks with Lot. He talks with Laban. There's nobody obscure or corrupt enough to be free from God's intrusion into his life.
That's true, and he's always willing to give reasons for what he does. Although from time to time, to be sure, he must say, I can give you no reason because you wouldn't understand it. Nevertheless, he will listen to query and complaint. And he's very sensitive, I take it, to the claim sometimes brought against him that he is not just.
Well, there's something, I think, more than that. If we take the first great conversation, first great colloquy between Abraham and God at the time of the threatened destruction of Sodom and Gomorrah, I get the impression that what God is trying to do with Abraham is to urge him, although without words, appeal to my mercy. It looks on the surface as though Abraham is questioning God. He says, will you destroy the city and sweep away the just with the unjust? If there are 50 men, and Abraham, superficially at least, seems to be sweating it out, going from 50 to 45 and then down to the number 10. But all the while, if you read carefully, you get the impression that God is implying, you appeal to my mercy. It's perfectly all right. And that's what I take to be the meaning of the fact that at 10, Abraham stops. Why didn't Abraham go down and reduce the principle to its final, so to speak, logical conclusion, supposing there's only one man? And I get the impression that Abraham was afraid there wasn't even one man, and he'd have no case whatsoever.
You mean not even his nephew Lot?
Not even his nephew Lot, because his nephew Lot, first of all, wasn't included. He was warned to leave the city. And that raises another point, by the way, now you mention it. The argument also seems to have a secondary significance. Abraham could have said to God, you're not going to destroy the innocent with the guilty. Let the innocent be taken out and destroy the city. And Abraham doesn't do that. He said, you're going to destroy the city, implying that if you destroy the city, you must destroy the others as well. What's the meaning of that?
Well, it is very strange. I must confess I have no answer offhand. Have you?
No, not an answer, but I have a kind of surmise that what we are dealing with here isn't just individuals, but with organized society, and that here you have a social organism which, as such, is on the point of dissolution because it cannot stand up to the elementary necessities of life, which are, in the deepest sense, moral. And therefore the organism goes as such.
Yes, and whereas later on God will want to destroy the whole race of Israel because of its backsliding, because of its stiff-necked opposition to him and indifference to him, yet he can always be persuaded not to do so, and that's what some of our colloquies will be about.
That's right, to digress a moment.
You know, Maurice, let me remind you that during this colloquy between Abraham and God about the destruction of the cities of the plain, you're quite right that Abraham sweats that out, because 3 times at least he pauses or interrupts himself and says, but look, listen, what am I doing? Here am I, asking God to do something he presumably does not want to do. Here am I arguing with him, whereas I'm mere dust and ashes. Isn't it presumptuous of me to do this? Here I am venturing to speak to the Lord. Please don't be angry with me. He makes all of these gestures of humility, and they're, of course, perfectly honest gestures, and yet he goes on making the request, and I think you may be right.
There's something in that.
I'll put it into his mind to appeal to God's mercy.
There's something in that also, I think, of the oriental flourish of a bargain, that you surround every concession and every request with a preliminary indication that I know I'm going to be very absurd when I suggest this, but won't you please consider it? There's also some kind of humor in it.
Yes.
There's a very gentle smile playing over the whole episode, that here God actually is naturally glad, rejoices that this man is so deeply imbued with the moral principle that he wants to know, why is this happening? And in the end, we see that the cities are hopelessly involved in corruption and in ruin. They cannot be saved as organisms. And coming to what you said about Moses, you remember that when Moses came down from the mountain and found the Israelites dancing around the golden calf, he was infuriated. He broke the tablets of the law, and he had God's threat, let me destroy this people and let me make a people out of you. And Moses said, don't do that. What will the Egyptians say? And all sorts of irrelevant arguments, actually, as though God had to take into account what will the Joneses think, that sort of thing. Actually, it was the same principle at work. Can this society or this people survive? Because Moses reflected, I presume, well, supposing God does make of me a new people, the same problem's going to rise again.
Yes, and of course, Moses also on that occasion dares to remind God of his original covenant with respect to the people of Abraham, Isaac, and Israel. He says, after all, you promised certain things, and here you seem to be forgetting your promise. The background of all this in my mind, the thing that makes it so important, and I think it's what makes the Bible, the great book that it is, really the book of the world, is that these persons who are subject to God, inferior to him in power, and, of course, life, are nevertheless, as I said, free and great. In other words, they are individuals. I know of no other religion which tells how God made individuals as God makes these individuals. And I think he meant it when he made them individuals. What is an individual except a person whom even God, in some sense, does not know? His knowledge may penetrate to all the parts of the universe, and yet there may be something at the center of any individual mind which God does not know. The individual still can surprise him, still can irritate him, or can please him more than he expected to be pleased.
And he leaves an area of the unpredictable in every individual, and that is the individuality.
And that's what individuality is.
Well, going back again to the colloquy of Moses with God, the best-known colloquy, I suppose, in the Bible is God and Moses at the burning bush. And what you said before, this small person arguing with God as to whether God's decree is really very wisely taken and oughtn't he to reconsider it. The amazing thing is to me that here was Moses, to whom God had never spoken before as far as the biblical narrative goes, at the burning bush. Suddenly the Lord of the universe, the maker of all the spaces, appears to him and says, go to Egypt and do these and these things. Moses answers with the two most famous words in any language. Who, me?
Yes, who am I?
He can't grasp it. You'd think that ordinarily the person would be overwhelmed, and if God has commanded it, well, there it is. And moreover, he would be filled with a megalomaniac consciousness of having been selected. But the individuality is not shattered, as you point out. It seems to be there, this conversation, for the purpose of bringing out this individuality. And there's no wonder that Moses is spoken of as the meekest man in the world, and the meekest that ever lived, if in such circumstances, instead of going off his head and becoming quite mad with a sense of power and privilege, he says, look, I can't even speak. I'm not a good speaker.
Yeah.
What am I going to do about it? The triviality of it. As a matter of fact, Moses is a very good speaker, because the things he says in various places in the Bible have the authentic power of a great master of words. But he says, I can't speak.
Yeah.
So send me.
And of course, God is almost angry with him. At one point, when he repeats that statement, God says, if you did speak, who would make you speak? Whose words would you be?
He's not very angry, because what he finishes up with is, all right, take Aaron, and you'll tell him what to say, and he'll be your mouthpiece.
You said, Maurice, that Moses speaks two very famous words. I might say three. Who am I? When God gives him this responsibility to speak to all of his people about what they should do. Of course, in answer to that, God speaks the most famous words that he, I suppose, ever speaks in this book. When Moses says to him, but nevertheless you say you will be with me, you try to reassure and comfort me, and yet, what will happen when I go to my people and say that you spoke to me? What will happen if they ask me what your name is? What is his name? What am I to say to them then? And then I suppose, quite possibly the most important words in the Bible are spoken. I am that I am. I am who I am. I am has sent you. Because nothing else so perfectly underlines the Hebrew conception, which I take to be basic, the conception that the existence of God is more important than anything else about him. He is the only person, with a capital P, I suppose, that truly and wholly and simply exists. His existence is a thing that the Hebrews had a conception of such as no other people have ever had.
Is there he divests himself of identity because he cannot be identified.
Yeah.
In the
But he is being. He
is being itself. In the later development of Jewish theology, it's made manifest that you do not define God by anything except the absence of anthropomorphic identification.
No, the absence of non-existence. So
that's it.
The Greeks had another view of their gods, it seems to me, altogether. They thought of their gods as having natures. They had the god of this, the god of that. Their gods behaved certain ways. Their gods had form. Their gods had, of course, many names and biographies and whatnot. And the Greeks, consistently with that, had this consuming interest in the nature of the world. What is it like? In other words, they were scientists and artists, but the Hebrews, from the first to the last, it seems to me, were able to hold on to the idea of mere existence. Well, the existence of God was more important than anything else.
Well, that's it. I think you've touched on something essential here. I suppose that in one way we can distinguish between the Greek outlook on the nature of God and the Hebrew outlook by contrasting Xenophanes with the Bible. Xenophanes saying that man makes God in his image. You remember that famous passage of his? He says that if Thracians would picture God, they would make God with red hair and snub noses. And if a horse would think of God, he would think of him as a horse. And the Hebrews said that God made man in his image, not the other way around.
And they always stuck to that.
And it goes down to the modern world, too, by the way. When you think of the extreme scientificist, I won't say scientific, the scientificist attitude on God and man, you come to Pavlov, who said that man consists of nothing but conditioned reflexes, and he quotes the dog, and which is, by the way, spelled the opposite word of God, D-O-G and G-O-D. And the answer of the Jewish outlook is, it is not a conditioned reflex in its multiplied varieties that are represented here. There's something that conditioned reflexes cannot explain.
Well, now, the Greeks, I think, would never have been able to write such a thing as the first chapter of Genesis. I think they had not that kind of interest in the beginning of the world. I think for them the world never began. They had very little curiosity about what the world would be like if there weren't any. They took the world as it was, examined it as scientists, reproduced it as artists, but did not speculate concerning the awful fact of its sheer existence, whereas the Hebrews, beginning as they did with this first chapter of Genesis, when God makes the world out of nothing, which the Greeks said nothing could not be done. You see, the Greeks thought quite firmly that nothing could be made out of nothing. The Hebrew said there was nothing, and then there was the world. And that remains, I should say, the paramount fact throughout. You have the sense that God can unmake the world.
Well, that is something I think that we referred to in last year's talks, this problem of the Greek and the Hebrew and the contrasting effects of their final philosophy. But it comes down, as we return to these colloquies that we are discussing, it comes down also to a respect for personality. If there is this power, and if this power created man, it didn't create man as an automaton, because that isn't an act of creation. And again, in the conversations between Moses and God, there's one of the most remarkable, one of the most moving as well, one that one can hardly read carefully without tears coming to one's eyes, when Moses has what one might almost call an angry conversation with God. You remember when the Israelites became sick of the manna?
Yes.
And they said, standing at the doors of their tents and weeping, they said, there's nothing but this manna in front of us, and you remember the leeks and the onions and the garlics that we used to eat in Egypt for nothing, too. They got it for nothing. Such is the memory of man, by the way. They forgot what they paid for it.
Yes.
And then there's a conversation between Moses and God, and what Moses says first is, why hast thou dealt ill with thy servant? I can't carry these people. Why should I carry them as a nursing father carries his little ones? I can't carry this burden. He doesn't blame the Israelites. He first of all alludes to his own incapacity. And then, when God tells him, I'll give them meat, he said, I'll give them meat not only for 1 day, and for 2 days, and for 10 days, and for 20 days. I'm going to give them for a month, till it creeps out of their nostrils. Yeah. So I'll teach them to eat meat. And then suddenly Moses perks up his ears and says, what? You're going to slaughter herds and cattle? They wouldn't suffice. What do you mean? It's like two people arguing, like two partners in an enterprise. You can't do this sort of thing. He forgets all of a sudden that he's speaking to the omnipotent, to the almighty, who can create millions of herds. It just terrifies him that he'll have to feed 600,000 people with meat, and where am I going to get it from?
Yes, where can I get meat to give to all those people? And of course they do get it. They get too much of it, and as a matter of fact, thousands of them die, don't they, from plague, while the meat is in their teeth.
Between their teeth. Tradition tells us, to heighten the effect, that actually the manna which the Jews ate in the wilderness wasn't just, as the Bible intimates, like coriander seed, that actually it could be cooked in an infinite variety of forms, and it tasted like anything that you want. And there's a very good warrant for this interpretation, because once you get the notion that the Israelites, this still undisciplined and unformed and uncrystallized people, actually, within a year or two, I don't think it was more, having left Egypt, suddenly said, oh, how nice it was over there. We had all the food that we wanted. We didn't pay a thing for it. There is the element of perversity there and of ingratitude, which makes it quite probable that the manna was any kind of food that you wanted, and what they were protesting against was the rigor of their self-discipline in any form, their refusal to take on character, their incapacity to appreciate they were no longer slaves and they had to bear the responsibilities and the pangs of free men. And this was the root of the trouble, not the fact that there wasn't meat to eat.
Surely. I hope that we can remember the particular animus, with, if I may use that word, with which God promises enough meat to come out of their nostrils. Hope we can remember that when, on a later occasion, we should be talking about the famous conversation between Samuel and God. When the people have asked Samuel for a king, almost the same thing happens. God says, no, they had better not have one. They have one.
What happens, that's not just for 40 days, but he gives them kings, all right, for something.
For generations.
For generations, and then they learn what the taste of it is when the king, as happened to in the majority of instances, wasn't one that either pleased the people or pleased God. Here's one of the interesting uniformities that run through the majority of the conversations. You find that never does a man, or hardly ever does a man, plead with God to do something wrong. What God inspires the man to do is to plead for something right.
That's very important.
At the very worst, you find Cain answering with that churlish and immortally brutal statement, "Am I my brother's keeper?" This evasiveness. But you don't have someone going to God having said that he will deal with someone mercifully and deal with people gently, saying, "No, don't do that. You destroy them." It's always the other way around. It is God provoking man to dwell upon his attribute of mercy and to form a sort of notion that if you plead with him, which is what he wants you to do, you are actually penetrating to his inmost nature.
Very shortly after this colloquy about the meat, another one occurs. As a matter of fact, Aaron is the talker in this case, rather than Moses. Very shortly after the episode of the meat, you may remember Miriam and Aaron begin to speak against Moses because of the Ethiopian woman whom he had married, for he had married an Ethiopian woman. And they said, "Is it only through Moses alone that the Lord has spoken? Has he not spoken through us as well?" And the Lord heard Aaron and Miriam saying this. Now the man Moses was very modest, was very meek, as you've just been saying. And he would not have protested himself. But God does protest. He asks Moses to bring Aaron and Miriam before him. Says, "Come, all of you three, to the tent of meeting." And they go there. And God then says very plainly to Miriam and Aaron that they should not have spoken against his prophet. "Mouth to mouth do I speak with him, plainly and not in riddles, and the very form of the Lord does he behold. Why then were you not afraid to speak against my servant Moses?" So the anger of the Lord blazes against those two, and Miriam suddenly becomes leprous, white as snow with leprosy. And it is then that Aaron, through Moses, I believe, protests to God against the cruelty of that, against the fact that it is beyond necessity at all, and God instantly changes his mind and lets her be in that condition only for a while, and then she is well again. So here's a further case in which God can be appealed to undo something that he's done when his anger blazes. Probably half the colloquies, wouldn't you say so, deal with that situation.
The appeal to mercy and the encouragement in men to appeal to him. I was thinking while you mentioned the Miriam and Aaron episode and the Ethiopian woman, I was thinking of that incident where it's reported to Moses that people are running through the camp prophesying also, as though he'd be shocked at this usurpation of his privilege. And you remember his answer, "Would to God that everyone, but that they would all prophesy the way I could," which is the most natural answer for him to give. And almost it isn't like modesty. It is so instinctive and organic with him that he feels like someone, to take a lesser illustration for a greater thesis, someone who enjoys music greatly. I wish everybody did.
Yeah.
Or who has some intellectual enjoyment. I wish everybody did. It doesn't occur to him as being confined to him. And it is always the smaller people who are more jealous of the privileges of their leader than the leader himself, if he is a leader in that spirit.
What do you think about this matter? Sometimes when I read those colloquies in which one of the heroes, doubting his own capacity perhaps to carry out God's will, and doubting even that it is God who is speaking to him, because sometimes that doubt seems to exist, asks God for a sign. You remember Moses does not hesitate to ask him for a sign.
Yes, at the burning bush he asks for a very powerful sign.
Yes, and the sign comes. The sign in that case is that his hand put into his bosom becomes leprous and then ceases to be so. What is the other one?
The snake.
The snake.
The rod which is turned into a snake.
Yes, it turns into a snake and then it becomes a staff again. Gideon, of course, much later, when he is needed as a judge to save Israel, is suddenly confronted by God with this duty that lies before him. And he very frankly says, yes, but how do I know that it is you speaking to me? Will you give me a sign? Will you do certain things right now here before me? There's the famous business of the fleece. Remember the fleece?
Yeah, well, the first thing was, of course, that the angel, or the text sometimes uses the word for God, or in one place at any rate, and in another place it says the angel of the Lord. He stretched out his staff and consumed the sacrifice with the food with the flame. And then there was the fleece, wet and dry.
Yes.
That's against the dry and wet atmosphere.
Yes, all the dew should fall on everything else except the fleece, and then the reverse.
Yes.
Well, now, I wonder why it is that God does not protest against this request for a sign. Why doesn't he say, you should be able to believe me simply and purely?
Here is what I've often thought about. Among the pagans, it was the custom for a man to make up his mind to do a thing, and then he went to the auguries. And the entrails of birds, or the flying of birds, or the way the birds pecked at the food, he had made up his mind first. In the case of the Hebrew tradition, God came to him and said to him, you've got to do this. And the man doubted, possibly, whether he was called to this mission, whether he wasn't having illusions. It wasn't he who forced the issue. It was God who came with the issue to him, and the man said, well, I just don't trust myself. Give me such overwhelming evidence that I feel no hesitancy in going ahead with this.
Yes, but you see, my only point is this. The man might very well doubt his own capacity, doubt that he could do this tremendous thing that he's now asked to do. But perhaps he shouldn't doubt that it is God who is asking him to do it.
In the very first instance, I like to think of it another way, that here a man is, and suddenly out of the blue, almost literally out of the blue, there comes this terrific experience. It is proper for him to doubt himself. He reels under
himself, yes, by all means.
And doubting himself, he must doubt the evidence of his senses at first, until by repetition and confirmation it's made abundant to him. Either he is completely mad, in which case he's not responsible, or else this is the ultimate reality which is operating through him. There is a contrast here, and a violent contrast, with the attitude of the pagan world, in which the power resides in the man. He looks for auguries, but he is the originating power. So we see in the instance that you've just cited, that Gideon should not ultimately become a megalomaniac and be carried away by this privilege. He is forced to reduce his army. You remember, first send away the people who are faint of heart. I don't want them in my midst. And then afterwards they went down at the famous well of Harod, or the spring of Harod, and those men that lapped water with their tongues like dogs, out. And those that modestly took the water in their cup, in the cup of their hands, and drank it in a human fashion, they were the ones to do it. Only 300. That further reduced any possibility that Gideon would say, think of himself, I've been the man that's destined, I can do it with anything. By the way, there's a colony there now at Ein Harod in Israel today. It's called by that name, the Well of Harod, one of the oldest and the largest of the colonies that we have in the New Israel.
Well, Gideon obviously was a man for signs, because he even asked God to make some signs whereby the people themselves might be chosen. Well, I quite agree that that would have been beyond the power of any man to understand what, after all, he can understand when a sign is given him. I mean, the authority must be translated. Isn't that the word of God coming too directly?
There's what you suggest, the double problem. The man must not be crushed.
Yes.
The man must remain a man, and therefore, if he's to remain a man, he cannot identify himself with God and say, God said this, I have no doubts, I am everything. There's that problem. On the other hand, he has to be the instrument and therefore has to accept his destiny. And the play between these two problems is the one that produces the spirit of these colloquies.
You have just heard The Words We Live By, the 13th in the 15-week Eternal Light Summer Series. We invite you to join us again next week for another in this series of outstanding literary dialogues of past years, featuring Mark Van Doren and Maurice Samuel. Our program will be the 9th of 10, entitled The Supporting Cast of the Bible.
The Words We Live By is produced under the auspices of the Jewish Theological Seminary of America. This pre-recorded program has been an NBC Public Affairs presentation.